Okay, so welcome. Thanks for joining us for our ESP webinar today entitled The Science of a Successful Presentation. We have Katie McFarland from the University of Idaho with us. Just some housekeeping. You will receive a follow-up email next week with the recording and any additional resources, information, links that Katie might want to share. So know that that's coming your way. If she's willing, we will send out a PDF of the presentation as well with that so that if you don't want to take notes, you'll have access to that as well. So without further ado, I guess questions. So feel free to unmute yourself, or if you want to drop them in the chat, I will capture those for Katie and we'll make sure those all get answered. So if you have something in the moment and want to do that, I know Katie's allowed time at the end as well to answer any questions. If you're like me and you come up with a question and you want to drop it in the chat so you don't forget it, because you might think of another question and then the first one's gone sometimes. So either way is fine. So Katie, I will turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. And yes, because of the topic, I don't mind if you guys want to ask questions right then, because we're going to go through a lot of pieces and your question may be specifically related to that piece. And so we can go over that as we go, but I will save time at the end so we can go over things. I am going to open my presentation and then give you guys a little bit of background of where this presentation is coming from and why. So I am a doctoral student with the Idaho State University. Actually, I do work for University of Idaho out here in Theta chapter, but I am a doctoral student at Idaho State University studying Instructional Design and Technology. And through my work with Instructional Design and Technology, I have found some information that can be very relatable to us as extension educators. I have a master's degree in youth development, so I don't have formal education training. And so as I've gone through this, it's given me some really valuable tools. Some of them I was doing already, and some of them I have learned through this process. But I've gained some tools that I would like to share with you guys to help create powerful presentations. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. The first thing that we're going to start with is kind of the foundation. So the human brain can only process so much information at one time. So we have our inlets with our audio and our visual. And so we can bring in information visually or audibly. If we, however, are trying to bring in too much through one of those channels, 2 pieces of information or 3 pieces of information, then our brain does what's called a split attention effect, and it reduces our capacity to remember things because we're now focusing on 2 different things. So an example of that would be if I am showing you a demonstration and I'm also putting text up at the same time, that can cause you to try to watch the demonstration, but also read the text. So then your ability to bring in that information visually is split. So it's a split attention effect. And I very much have this problem. I'm a compulsive reader. So if there are words on the screen, I start reading them. So then that brings us to a little bit more deeper into that, the cognitive load theory. And so there's a lot of research behind cognitive load theory, and it basically is saying that we only have so much space in our brains for knowledge. And the way we gather that knowledge is in a certain order. And if something happens in that order, we can lose that knowledge. So for us as educators, we need to be aware of the best way to provide that knowledge so that we don't cause our own hiccups in that theory and we don't end up losing information when we're teaching. So the information will come in, like I said, either visually or audibly. That's our sensory memory. And we can lose it then, or we can keep it then. Most of the time, if students are engaged, they're keeping it. They'll move that into their working memory. And in their working memory, that's where they're going to start making connections. That's our encoding. So if they've heard of something similar, or they've had some pre-training and they kind of know the topic or it's similar to something else, they start making those connections, and then they can go ahead and code that into their long-term memory. Of course, it goes back the other way. You can pull that from your long-term memory into your working memory. So if you're testing for transfer, recall of that information you've provided, they can do that. But if there's hiccups in this process, then we lose the ability to put all that information into our long-term memory. So by reducing the amount of bumps in that process, we as educators can provide our learners an opportunity to learn as much as they can. So we can make it better for them by putting our presentations and our workshops and our classes in a way that makes it easier for our learners. So there are three types of this cognitive load that we just talked about. There's the extraneous load, and this is the effort needed to sort through what's relevant and what's not relevant. So you're given a bunch of information and you have to decide, do I need to learn this, or is this something that is just there and I don't need to retain that information? You have your germane load, and that's actually the effort needed to understand the material. That's the processing part of it. So that's the cognitive part of your brain that says, what is this and what does it mean? And then the intrinsic load is the effort that you need to be able to sort through things and look at those complex objectives. So you need to be able to process them. So there are different ways that we can reduce all three of those loads. So that's where we get to the cognitive theory of multimedia design. Most of our presentations, even if they're not on Zoom, are multimedia. We typically have a PowerPoint presentation, or we have some videos, some visual aids, some narration, something that we're using multimedia for in a lot of our classes anymore. And so it's important to understand the theory of multimedia design so that we can make the most out of that information that we're presenting. So because we can only take in 2 pieces of information at a time, and that information needs to then be sorted and remembered, we need to have tools that we can use to align that knowledge with our design to maximize learning for everyone. So that's basically kind of the nutshell version of the cognitive theory of multimedia design. Now, kind of the guru of our multimedia design is Richard Mayer, and he has developed, there's 2 books. I have the 2nd edition and the 3rd edition pictured here, but it's basically the rules to make a presentation effective. It's the how-to, and it's those principles we're going to be talking about. So if you want to learn more about this subject and you want to go into a lot more depth than I'm going to go today in just our short time together, I would recommend getting one of these books. The 3rd edition is fairly new. It's only about a year old, so it just came out, but the 2nd edition is just as good, especially if you're just beginning with this. The 3rd edition has a few changes where he's added a couple of principles, but still the meat of it is really still there in that 2nd edition, if that's all you can manage to track down. Again, I will send out my PowerPoint, so you'll be able to see these titles again if you don't get them written down, or do a screenshot real quick. So the first principle that we're going to talk about is the Coherence Principle. It basically states people learn better when extraneous material is excluded rather than included. So if we don't give our audience a whole bunch of extra stuff they have to sort through, we're going to be more effective because they're going to know what's important. So doing things like, we call them the seductive details, but if it's just like a cool, interesting thing, but it's not really relative to the learning, that would be a seductive detail. Sometimes people use those at the very beginning. I always remember in school, they're like, start with an interesting sentence to get people's attention, when you're writing an essay or something. But steer clear of those throughout a lot of your presentation. Having background music can be very distracting. If I had some loud music going on right now while I'm trying to teach you guys, that would be hard for you to learn. Use simple visuals. Don't have it overstimulating so that the learner is having to sort through everything and figure out which part of this is am I supposed to be paying attention to. And if you only include information and graphics that relate to your learning objective, it's going to be a lot easier for your learner to identify what they're supposed to be seeing with that. So I have examples with each one of these principles, a poor example and a good example to kind of help illustrate that. I try to use a variety of disciplines and extensions so you can kind of, if you don't relate to one, hopefully you'll relate to another one and understand how it could be important in your work. So this is an example of why we have, there's a lot of information going on here. So the head title, we've got the seductive detail. Did you know that onions have more potassium than bananas? Make half your plate fruits and vegetables. We've got my plate. We've got a ton of fruits and vegetables. I'm sorry, guys. I'm at home with kids who apparently don't seem to care. Apparently the TV show didn't distract them. Okay, so then you can also see there's a big sign, don't use this, use this. You know, there's arrows, there's lines, there's lots going on with this. So we've got some movement. This gets bigger, you know, more animation. What we're trying to say with that screen is make half of your plate fruits and vegetables, and we want to draw attention to the my plate. But when you look back at this, is that what you're seeing with this, and that's what you're remembering? Because a lot of people, when they see this, they're thinking, oh wait, onions, they have more potassium than bananas, that seems important for me to know. But what I'm really trying to teach my learners is how to use their my plate correctly. And with all the extra stuff going on in the background, it's hard for the learners to see that. So the signaling principle, it's people learn better when cues that highlight the organization of the essential materials is added. I always talk about it with, you know, our 4-H kids. I say, tell them what you're going to say, and then say it, and then tell them what you said. And so this is the tell them what you're going to say part of that. So use arrows and highlighting to signal attention to important information. You can include an advanced organizer or a title. I do some work with asynchronous learning classes. And so if you kind of have that ticker down the side so they know what section they're in and what's coming next, that's a good example of how you can use an organizer to let people know what's coming. And just don't get overexcited. You put too much signaling and people don't know what they're supposed to be looking at. Again, we're kind of overloading the system. So right here we have, here's a recipe out of the USDA Guide to Home Canning. And I want people to learn about adjusting for altitude. So the question, how long should we process pear apple jam at 3,000 feet altitude? Well, somebody brand new to this, it's going to take them a while. They're going to read through that whole recipe. They're going to try to figure out what's going on, and they're not going to be sure where to find that information. If we do it like this, where we show them, here's where we're at in the learning process. We're learning about altitude adjustment. And if you see the yellow arrow where it says processing time at altitude on the recipe, it shows the learner exactly where to look to get that information. So they're now aware of what they're learning. And as we get ready to go to the next slide, it says preparing jars. And they think, okay, I should be paying attention to what procedures they're telling me that are going to be effective to prepare my jars. So by signaling, you get the learner ready for the information that's coming ahead. The redundancy principle, people learn better from graphics and narration than from graphics, narration, and printed text. So this is what we were talking about with that split attention effect specifically, because if there's too much going on and trying to come in through the audio and visual receptors, we're going to overload that system and people aren't going to be able to remember. So when you're giving a narrated presentation, it's a good idea to either have graphics or text, but not put both on there. So I don't want to try to show somebody exactly, if there's a picture, I'm talking about it, and those words are coming up on the screen. That's going to be really confusing for people. One reason why I don't like to put everything I'm going to say on my PowerPoints, because people will just sit there and read the PowerPoint instead of listening to you talk. Sometimes we forget as presenters that PowerPoints are visual aids. They're not our crutch. So we want to use those to make sure our point gets across. I like to use them as a kind of ready-made notes for the people taking the class, but I don't want it to be, here's a whole text, all this text, a paragraph of information that I'm expecting you to listen to me while you're reading it. And that'll cause too much overload. So you want to be able to minimize the use when you're doing a narrated presentation so you don't have too much going on. Bulleted lists are fine, but if you get too much going, then you're going to overwhelm. So this is a video clip I have of the redundancy principle, and it narrates that. So we're going to play that for you guys.
Methods. In this example, the redundancy principle is violated when I read the on-screen text. In this case, the on-screen text is duplicated by the narration. It is sometimes tempting to record audio for on-screen text, thinking that learners may have multiple learning styles, such as visual and auditory, and that this would help both. So stop. The fact is that it is contrary to how we know people learn and process.
So there's a perfect example of what happens when we just read the information on the screen. And I don't know about you guys, but I start reading ahead. And if you're a fast reader, you're ahead of your narrator, and then you're not really listening because instead you're reading. So that's an example of what happens when we just copy and paste it over. Now, I'm not saying that you don't want to have visuals. It is important because some people do prefer learning one way or another. So having that text, like I mentioned, is not bad, but you want to make sure that you're doing it in the right way that does not overlap. Let's see here.
Narration to discuss the diagram.
There we go. Okay, so
as you can see, there are many different cuts of beef that come from different parts of the animal. As we go through our lesson, we will explore each one of these cuts and where they come
so you
from
can
in
see that's an
relation to
example
the beef
where
carcass.
we are not using the same text and the same narration, but we're talking about the visual and the graphic that we have there. So people can be looking at that graphic and listening to the information, and they're not overlapping that information coming into their brain. Okay, so our spatial continuity principle. People learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented near rather than far from each other on the page or screen. So if we're talking about presenting, if we're either having a worksheet and we have the question on one page and the activity on the other page, that's going to be really confusing for people. Or if we're doing an asynchronous class and it's just automatically rolling, if you have the instructions on one slide and the activity on the other, that becomes difficult for people to remember. I don't know how many classes I've been in like this, where the instructor will give me instructions about something we're supposed to talk about in our groups, and then they'll flip to another slide, and then we have to talk about it in our groups, and I cannot remember for the life of me what we're supposed to be talking about in our groups. And so that's kind of an example of that spatial continuity. So it's like, make sure that things are like physically close together. So if we place text and graphics near each other, we have feedback near the questions it refers to, make sure that things are on the same screen as the activity, or have people be able to read something before that animated graphic so it's not disconnected. So again, I have another example of that. So if I were to give you this activity, I'm an FCS educator, so a lot of these are FCS based, but I do try to mix it up with some other stuff. But if I give you an example, okay, I want you to identify the parts of the jar. So you're going to unscramble the words in the left column and then use the unscrambled words to label the parts of the jar. So I'm going to tell you what to do, and then I'm going to hand out this piece of paper to you guys in class, and it has no instructions on it, and it's the parts of the jars, and you go, wait, what did the instructor just say? What am I supposed to be doing with this? And it causes our brains to work harder. Instead of focusing on what we're trying to learn here, we're now trying to remember directions. And so when we reduce that cognitive load and give our learners the ability to just focus on what we're trying to teach, it can make it a lot easier. So an example of that would be this. We have the instructions on either the worksheet or the slide so that the learner doesn't have to try to remember that. They're not using that working memory to remember directions. They're using that working memory and long-term memory to remember those words that you told them about parts of the jar, and they can actually use that and exercise that. So it gives our learners an opportunity to use less brain power to do the same activity, which is going to increase our learning. So then there's the temporal continuity principle. So similar to spatial, but instead, we're going to talk about people learning better when corresponding words and pictures are at the same time rather than after each other. So we're not talking about physically close to each other, like I showed you in the last example, but within each other in the learning. So time narrations that are appropriate to the animation. So we're not talking about them being near each other in space, but near each other in time. So there's an example of this. Okay, so I have a picture of the parts of the sprayer nozzle, and then I go over here to the parts of the sprayer nozzle, and we start talking about it. Now, again, we have parts separate, and we have the sprayer nozzle separate. Now, I do believe there's supposed to be an audio on this one, but I don't see that happening today, but let's see if it happens with this one. There we go.
Number 1, the nozzle body holds the strainer and tip. Number 2, the strainer screen prevents a clogged nozzle. Number 3, tip gasket. Number 4, the spray tip determines the flow, rate, and droplet pattern. Number 5, the cap holds the nozzle body and tip in place.
So the narration is connected to what's popping up on screen at the same time. Now, if we just had the narration just going through and what's on there is what's on there, it would be more confusing to our learners. So by being able to put those two pieces together, it makes it, again, less cognitive load, and they're not trying to figure out where we're at or what's going on. Same would be if you had an actual demonstration. So for example, if you had a piston moving up and down and you're explaining how that piston moves up and down, your narration would be coordinated with the movement of that piston, so that then your learner is like, okay, that's what I'm seeing and hearing at the same time. The segmenting principle is people learn better when a multimedia message is presented in user-paced segments rather than a continuous unit. This one we usually do pretty well anyway. I mean, we know, especially when you're having, I always think back to when I was having people join ESP and I would have them read the creed. I had to break it up into little segments, because if I read the whole paragraph, they couldn't remember to repeat it after me. So I would break it up into smaller pieces that people could remember. And so being able to take our information and breaking it down into smaller lessons is a way for our learners to not have to process as quickly, because they can then take a moment to move that information, make those connections, and move it into their long-term memory without having to try to just gather that all up in their working memory and then try to make connections later, because we're going through too much information at one time. Allowing your users to be able to control the speed of that, especially when we're talking about an asynchronous lesson where they're going through, rather than how I have my slides that just flip over after the audio. If my slides stopped and the user had to physically click next, that's an example of user controlled speed. And it's even better for our learners, because they can reread something if they need to, they can take a little bit more time if they need to, and they have the ability to, when they're ready, they can move on to the next thing. So breaking things down, basically just like it sounds, segmenting that information into smaller pieces so it's less strain on our learners' cognitive load. So if I were to hand out steps to canning and I go through this whole process really quickly, we're going to learn how to can. We're going to go through these steps, and here's everything you guys need to know. Okay, so you're down to step 5. So let's just go ahead and get out our jars and start canning. My learners are going to be like, wait, what just happened? It flipped too quickly. I didn't have time to read it. That's a lot of information. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing. You can't condense an entire lesson down to 5 points and show it in 5 minutes and expect your learners to be able to retain that information. So if I were to break it down like this, it's much smaller pieces, and each time the user can click onto one of those pieces and learn something new. So they're going to learn the steps to canning. Choosing safe recipes is where we're starting. So they know to always use a tested recipe, always use up-to-date recipes, do not alter them, and make sure everything is tested. So that way they have that ability to read that information at their own pace, and it's broken down into small pieces that they can then think about and internalize and make those cognitive connections and move it into their long-term memory, so they have that information later, rather than just trying to stuff it all. It's like if you were at the grocery store and you just shoved a bunch of stuff into your basket really fast, and then you get home and you're just trying to shove it all into the refrigerator without sorting through any of that or making sure if it's refrigerated or if it goes in the pantry or if you're using it tonight for dinner. You're just trying to shove it all in there. Not everything's going to fit. And it's the same thing with cognitive load. If we don't give our learners the opportunity to stop and piece those pieces where they need to go, they're going to be overloaded and miss information. Okay, the pre-training principle. This is kind of like signaling that we talked about before, but it's a little bit more in depth. So instead of just getting people prepared for what they're going to learn, you're going to give them the tools they need to be able to learn. So if somebody doesn't know the names or the main concepts or the characteristics of something you're talking about, they're not going to be able to learn it, no matter how well you teach it. They need to be able to know what words mean. They're going to need to be able to know certain pieces. You can't just tell someone to build an engine without starting and explaining to them how a spark plug works. Or if they don't even know what a spark plug is, it's going to be very difficult for them to even follow directions to build an engine. So you need to make sure you start at that low level. So any pre-training that needs to be done. Now, we as educators need to think about our audience and need to think about their experience, what they may or may not know. Have they taken other classes like this before? Or do we have no idea what our audience knows or doesn't know? And how can we prepare them best to learn? Because if we start talking, I always tease new educators because they come on and start using all these. There's NESCS and there's ESP and there's NACDP and there's going, what are all of these acronyms for? So they have no idea what we're talking about because they don't know our key terms. So if we get them started with key terms, then they're going to be able to move up. So it's piecing down the information to make sure people are ready to learn the information we're sharing with them. So if they need to have a tool to learn something, you've got to give it to them before you start the learning. So example of this, if I were to hand this out to nursing students and say, here you go, day one, here's these findings. I need you to explain these findings to your patient in layman's terms. Well, if this is a first year nursing student, they're looking and they're going, I don't know what a PQRS is, and I don't know what their MA and KB is, and I don't know what their what hydrokinesis is. I'm not going to be able to share that with someone because I don't have the tools I need to learn from this information. So if we were to hand out a handout to our nursing students that started with this, these are definitions. Bilateral means both sides. So you can tell your patient, oh, we've tested both sides of your kidneys. They both look good. Symmetric means this. And we go through all of those terms that they may be unfamiliar with. It's going to give them a much better understanding of that information. Because now when we look over at that handout, we can say, oh, well, I know what that is. And I know what that means. So I don't have to try to process that information while I'm also trying to learn how to transfer that information to layman's terms. So it gives the people the tools they need to be able to provide the information in valuable space instead of them trying to figure it out. I don't know if you guys have ever had a type of, like, you're trying to read an article and you spend half the time looking up what the words mean, so you don't even really understand what the article is trying to tell you because you're trying to figure out what it's saying. It's kind of the same example. The modality principle, people learn better when pictures and narrations are used instead of pictures and words. So this is kind of like the redundancy principle, but it goes that extra step. And instead of just saying, don't repeat, it says pictures and narration are better than pictures and words. So if you are going to teach someone how to do something, being able to show them a demonstration or a video or a picture and talk about that as it's happening is going to be better for your learner than words and pictures. And that's, again, because of that split attention effect. They're going to be reading words and looking at demonstrations or pictures. And so there's two visuals coming in on that visual channel. When we're doing narration and pictures, we're then only using one piece of information from one channel, and it's going to be easier to process. So try to minimize the amount of text if you're using narration, only listing key steps, bullet points, providing references, important information. It is helpful for non-native speakers to have that text because it will be easier for them to think of like closed captions or people who are hearing impaired also. That text is helpful for them, but for our general learners, it is not helpful and it's just adding too much information to try to process at one time. Okay, so here's an example of chocolate chip cookie making, and this is how we're misusing the modality principle.
To 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we start with 1 cup of softened butter, 1/2 cup of white granulated sugar, 1 cup of packed brown sugar. Okay, now using a hand mixer or stand mixer, let's cream this all together. Once it's creamed together, let's go ahead and scrape down the sides. At this point, we're going to add our eggs, one at a time.
Okay, so we have our exact text that they're showing in the demonstration. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm bouncing back and forth. I'm reading and then I'm watching and then I'm reading and then I'm watching. Now, baking chocolate chip cookies is pretty easy, but for someone who's never done it before, you're trying to understand what packed brown sugar is as you're reading it. And then you look over and they're already moved on to using the hand mixer. So you've missed seeing that visual cue to tell you what's going on. So that's why having the text with narration is not as helpful. So here's an example of how we would use a small amount of text with narration and our cookies. So it's the same clip.
To 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we start with 1 cup of softened butter, 1/2 cup of white granulated sugar, 1 cup of packed brown sugar. Okay, now using a hand mixer or
so the
stand
text
mixer,
we're using is very minimal. It's just the ingredients. So you can watch the video and you can listen. And then this is, did that say 350? And you can look, oh yeah, okay, 350. And you're not missing those pieces of information. It's just used as that aid to help you remember, not as that crutch where you're trying to do both things at once. You're not trying to split your attention.
Once it's creamed together, let's go ahead and scrape down the side.
Screen clicker. Please again. Okay, so the multimedia principle. And this is kind of, it's funny that it comes at one of the last lists because it's kind of the foundation of multimedia, but people learn better from words and pictures than just from words. That's why we use it. And that's why we like to be able to provide visual aids, or we like to be able to provide videos and pictures when we're teaching, especially if we're doing something asynchronous and online and we're not able to be demonstrating live in the classroom. But when we're doing that, we need to make sure that we're using images that illustrate the key points. They're clear and they're meaningful. They're not just decorative. And it's better to use something static rather than something animated if you're talking about identifying parts and pieces. So I gave the example of an engine, a piston moving. Of course, an animation would make sense. If you're trying to talk to somebody about the parts of the piston, watching it go up and down and trying to name the parts is going to be a lot harder. So you want a static image of that if you're trying to talk about naming parts. So an example of that. So if we're trying to teach our 4-Hers the parts of a chicken wing, here's a picture of a chicken, right? We've got our image and we've got our text, and we're going to say the first set of feathers is the primary feathers and the second set is the secondary feathers. Now this picture of a chicken is cute. It's decorative, it's fun, it makes the presentation a little more exciting, but it's not helping our 4-Hers learn which feathers are which by the picture. I mean, we talk about the first set, you can repeat the first set, but do you actually know where that is? So if we provide a picture like this with a wing, it shows where the first set of feathers are in the wing. So you have our primaries in pink and the secondaries in blue. So it actually is labeled, it's color coded, and it's easier for the student to look at that and say, oh, now I know exactly where their primary feathers are and the secondary feathers. Now, if the judge comes up to me during the fair, I can actually show them on my chicken where those wings are and that feathers are on those wings, rather than just saying, well, I know the first set is the primary and the second is the secondary. So it gives our learners an opportunity to really understand the subject that we're teaching. Okay, the personalization principle. People learn better from multimedia presentations when they're conversational rather than formal. And this makes sense. You don't want to read a dry instruction manual when you're trying to learn about something. And I think this is especially important for us as extension educators because most of our education is voluntary. No one is required to come to our class like they would be in a college course or an elementary school. They choose to come to our classes and learn about what we're teaching. And so we need to make that enjoyable and entertaining. And one of the ways we can do that is through the personalization principle. So not only does it make our learners feel more comfortable and more engaged, but it also helps them learn better. So it's important to use things like contractions. You can use first and second person. If you have a script, try to make it sound extemporaneous and not sound performed, which can be tricky. If you are recording asynchronous classes, it is better to find someone who can do that for you. If you are not a person who can just kind of conversationally read a script, then find someone who can, because it's going to be a lot more enjoyable for your learners to hear that conversational style than to just hear someone reading off a list. Using polite speech, like, please turn your books to page 2, or let's go ahead and look at this diagram, instead of page 2 is where this information is found. You need diagram 2. Like, it helps people feel engaged and connected, even if it's just through voice or it's through print. It's still important because it still makes your learner feel connected, rather than, again, they're reading this dry instructional manual. But it's really important, if you're doing a multimedia presentation, that you're including narration and a text or a visual. So I'm going to show you guys an example of that.
Step 1. When a flat tire occurs, pull over to a safe location. Put your parking brake on and set up reflective triangles if you have them. Putting on your hazard lights will allow other drivers to more clearly see you. If you do not feel safe where you are, call 911. Step 2. Following the owner's manual instructions, use the lug nut wrench to loosen the lug nuts. Make sure to unscrew all of the lug nuts at an equal rate to avoid the tire becoming unbalanced. Do not remove the lug nuts completely.
Okay, so that's excruciating for me to hear, because
Step 1.
that's
Safety first.
that's
When a
me.
flat tire
And to try to make myself sound like that was very difficult, because I'm not usually like that at all. So this is the one that just went ahead and kicked off. This is the conversational style using personalization.
Step 1. Safety first. When a flat tire occurs, pull over to a safe location. Put your parking brake on and set up a reflective triangle if you have one. Putting on your hazard lights, no matter the time of day, will allow other drivers to see you more clearly. If you don't feel safe where you are, call 911. Step 2. Loosen the lug nuts.
So much more pleasant to listen to. And definitely, we've all had some of those university trainings that are required, and they sound a lot like the first one, and they're just excruciating for us to learn. And it's going to be the same for our learners. We need to be able to sound like we are casual and we're not just a robot, but we are able to make that personal connection, and it will improve our learning. So the voice principle is kind of similar, because it's actually talking about using a human voice versus a machine generated voice. So people actually do learn better when something is spoken in human voice. So this is especially applicable for like an asynchronous class or a video where someone's just clicking on it and listening, and it's not an instructor involved live with the class. So there are some fairly decent technologies that we've implemented here at University of Idaho. I work with a gentleman who has a very strong accent, so he does not like to narrate his own videos because he knows he's hard to understand. So he uses a software, and his is very good, but you can still tell that it's a machine voice. Some are very poor, and you can definitely tell it's a machine voice. So if your choice is either a poor quality machine voice or getting someone else to do it, I would recommend getting someone else to do it. I have done voice editing for some people because they just want a different voice on their programming, and I don't mind doing that at all. It's not my job, it's not what I do, but I don't mind reading and talking and recording it. So if people need help with that, I like to do that. So surely you can find somebody who can help you with that, which will be a lot better than what you're going to hear in this next example.
There were 80 youth that attended the 6-session program. The majority were female 54% and 38% were Hispanic or Latino. Youth attending the 6 hours of lessons completed a post-survey made up of questions.
Okay, so that's our theory.
There were 80 youth that attended the 6-session program. The majority were female, 54%, and 38% were Hispanic Latino. Youth attending the 6 hours of lessons completed a post-survey made up of questions from 4-H Common Measures 2.0 Science Block.
Okay, so then there's our personal voice. And so we had Siri, and then we had me doing the narration. And it's much more pleasant to listen to a human voice than a machine. And it's actually not just more pleasant, but your learners are going to hear it better because they're not processing that strange machine voice wondering what's going on. It's normal talking for them, and it's much easier for them to interpret, and again, reduces that cognitive load. Now, the image principle. This is the only one of the principles listed that is a do not learn better. All the other ones were, if you do this, people learn better. If you do this, people learn better. This one is people do not necessarily learn better when the speaker's image is added to the screen. So that's kind of the tiny talking head, which is what I'm seeing right now with my full screen and my little head. So it actually doesn't improve the learning. Having someone there, some people are like, oh, you've got to have that person and you've got to have that connection. And if you can see the instructor during a presentation like this, then they're going to learn better. But it actually doesn't help. And so if you can avoid it, it's actually better. You can go ahead and include your face. It's not always bad. But if you want to make sure, one, that you establish that personal connection, which I think is important during webinars. This isn't just an asynchronous class. This is me teaching to my peers. And I feel like if you guys have a face behind that, it helps and kind of gives that connection that's important. So there are times when it's important. If you are just teaching a lesson, you don't necessarily have to have a face. A lot of the narrations that I showed you didn't have my face. So you could see that it wasn't an issue, whether it worked better or not. And if you don't have a lot of other distracting things, again, that visual of you is another visual process. So if you don't need it there for certain reasons, you can take that out and it will not affect learning. So I have some examples of that also.
Thank you for watching today's video. Today we'll be talking about how to create a post within Facebook. When you open your page, you just find the Create Post button. Click on the button and open a window that will allow you to create your post. Where you see the blinking cursor is where you can enter your text. Just like that. Then you can either add pictures or messages and different things associated with your post. You can also go into your planner, and that is in a different section of Facebook where you can schedule this post to appear at a different time.
So there's my talking head version. And here is the version with no face and much more focus on what's happening now.
Thank you for joining us today. We are going to learn how to create a post in our Facebook page. First, you'll go to the button that says Create a Post as you scroll through your page's feed. Click that button. Once it opens, you'll see another window where you are able to enter whatever text you would like. You are able to then add pictures or connect to Messenger and add other additional items to your post. If you need to schedule your post, you need to use...
It didn't make a difference whether my face was pictured or not. In fact, it seems less distracting that my face isn't pictured. Personally, I prefer to record videos where my face isn't pictured because then I'm not looking at myself wondering if I look weird, which as I look back on the video, think maybe I should have had a better camera angle, but it's less distracting and it can give your learners a clearer view. So hopefully you guys have picked up some tips that you can use in your either multimedia presentations in live workshops, or if you're designing asynchronous classes or videos, and you guys can use that. I included my email at the beginning, but I also put it right here if you guys have questions about things that you want to ask me after this, if you think of something. And I've even had people send me presentations and ask me to take a look at it and see what I could do to help out. And I don't mind doing that at all if I have the time. So I would be happy to do that for you as well. But with that being said, I will open it up to any questions. Okay, so I do see in chat that there's a question about white printing on yellow. Unfortunately, that's our university's branding. So it is hard to read. I am very simple, and I like things black and white. I know that makes things boring, so I do try to mix it up a little bit with some color, but you can't really go wrong with black text on a white or light background if you're really worried about your audience being able to see. And it does kind of make a difference in your audience as well. So if I'm working with teens, I definitely have a different style of presenting than I do when I'm working with adults or other extension educators. So you can keep that in mind. Oh, and then someone mentioned they like having their camera on at the beginning and then turning it off. I definitely like doing that as well. It's a great way to establish, hey, I'm a real person. I'm here to connect with you, but then it's not distracting throughout the presentation. I clicked too far up. Now I got to scroll down. Oh, somebody made a mention about looking into some other places that you can get information on visuals and graphics. How do you decide what works for each type of audience, teens versus adults? I think you just kind of got to work with that audience. Like I said, if you are, I have a colleague, she's been teaching lunch and learn sessions. For some reason, it has been a senior population of ladies. So knowing it's a senior population of ladies, I would make sure that my PowerPoint is clear and it's very contrasting and easy to read. If I'm working with teens, I definitely don't want to make it boring. So I usually add a little bit more color and some more visual interest. But again, you don't want to go over that edge and create that distraction as well. So it's just kind of experimenting with your audience and taking feedback, because they'll let you know if that's not working. Okay, somebody has a question about the AI presentations generation tools. I've used Powtoon, which is an AI generating, you can create a person and like an avatar, and then those people can be recorded saying and doing certain things. I have worked with a gentleman in our university who has used that. Again, they have found that it doesn't necessarily increase learning, but it also doesn't decrease learning. So if that's a tool you want to use, you certainly can. But what they've found when they use in kind of an AI agent, that as long as there's still that personal communication and it's not like the robot voice, very formal, that you're still going to get the same kind of effect. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask live?
So Katie, I just saw one I think it's a question from Marcia. She had put that she'd read you should only have 7 printed items on a screen. So maybe talking to the whole sentences versus bulleted points, maybe some.
Okay, yeah. So that's the magic rule of plus or minus 7. And so it basically says that your brain can only retain 7 pieces of information at a time. And that is one, you can read about that theory. It's one of the foundations for the cognitive load theory. And it's basically saying that you can't gather any more information than that. So you should have it very simplified. Full sentences versus bulleted lists. Again, it's kind of what your goal is. With this presentation, you guys aren't doing it asynchronously. I'm talking to you about it. You're likely going to print it off and refer back to it. So I wanted the information to be clear and thorough, but not overwhelming. So they are full sentences, but they're not paragraph forms. So I try to keep things simple like that. But yes, the more simple you can make your presentation, the more information your learner is going to get. That's tying into the whole split attention effect, but then also into your segmenting, where you're breaking it up into absorbable pieces. So you don't have to be stuck on 7. That is the magic number, but it's plus or minus because not everybody's brains work the same. But you want to make sure that it's not too much information, that somebody doesn't have a time to process that before you give them the next piece. So that's incorporating, like I said, your segmenting as well. Does that answer that question?
I think so. I think there's a couple in chat, Katie, that you might respond to. while you're thinking about those, I would just remind people that you will get a recording and a PDF of Katie's presentation later next week. Once it's posted on the ESP site, I will email it to the total registration list as follow-up, and then you'll have Katie's contact information as well if you didn't get it jotted down as well in that email. So.
Okay, so I do see the question about speaker's notes. My theory on this is that I do a handout. I would much rather have a very short presentation that just has those visual aids if I'm trying to illustrate something, and then have a handout. I'll do a bulleted handout with information. If I'm teaching a freezer mail class, I'll give them the tip sheet and I'll talk about all those things and I'll demonstrate them, but I don't have all that heavy information for them to read and look at. They have it to refer to and look at later. So that's kind of my tip for that. I do like putting speaker notes in though, because sometimes somebody else has to give your presentation. And so it's nice, or you don't remember what you said the last time. So they're handy for me, but in terms of my audience, I'd like to have something else separate for them. That's maybe like a bulleted list or a handout or additional information. There's another question about teaching for an audience that's mostly illiterate. So there's a lot of research out there on either illiterate audiences, hearing impaired audiences, visually impaired audiences, or non-native speakers. And so what they've kind of found is that if you know that you're working with a group of clients that reading is going to be harder, so then therefore making them work harder, more cognitive load, you're going to want to reduce that cognitive load. So less words on the screen. Use your animation and your narration to walk them through that. The exception kind of to that though is with our non-native speakers, because it's usually easier for non-native speakers to read the language than to listen to it and interpret it. So we actually have found that in non-native speaking audiences, it is helpful to have something like subtitles or text on the screen to help them process, because they still are having an increased cognitive load trying to translate that audio information. And same with our hearing impaired. If they're hearing impaired, they're not using their audio channel typically to process that information. So having it, they're very used to having it visually and then also having the lesson visually. It may need time to go slower. They may need to have to go back if they miss something visually, but they're used to that process. And so that's not a bad thing to provide text on screen. Okay, so there's a question about English and Spanish simultaneously. So are we, give me a description. Are you talking about like that both sets of text are in both languages, there's narration in both languages, or one's narration in one language and text in another language? Because I'm kind of thinking this through, like if you have narration in one language, like for example, English, and then you have text in Spanish, you're going to be looking at ways to reduce that audio to audio channel. I mean, the visual to visual channel within those Spanish speakers, because they're going to be watching and reading. So you want to make sure they don't have too much to read and too much to watch at the same time. So you're going to look at those principles where we make sure those things are close together and they're synchronized so that's not overtaxing them, because they're most likely not listening to the other language narration anyway. So they're only using that visual process. If you're having both texts simultaneously, I would suggest not doing that. I'd pick one or the other and then have one as audio. And that way you're not trying to run 3 channels of processing for those people as they're listening to one and listening to the other and then also trying to read. So pick one or the other. But if you want to have like a subtext in another language, I think that that's totally appropriate. And that's like what we talked about with those non-native speakers.
Well, thank you very much, Katie. Great presentation. I would just remind people, if you haven't signed up for the August 30th webinar, you should see some things coming from the ESP office. We'll take July off and be back in August to start another round of awesome ESP webinars. I think we've had great ones this round. I appreciate your input, Katie, and sort of connecting that research base to practical application and how it applies to extensions. So again, there'll be a follow-up email And I'm sure Katie would be more than happy to provide any additional help or conversation around the topic. So
Yes, thank you guys.